This lecture will focus on the situation of various ethnic groups in Ukraine during the Second World War and the colonization policies of Stalin and Hitler. The Bolsheviks rose to power championing the freedom of peoples within the Russian Empire. They initially fostered the development of national languages, cultures, and local elites. Yet by the late 1920s, a dramatic shift occurred as Soviet authorities began actively suppressing non-Russian people's aspirations for cultural independence. This policy ultimately led to arrests and systematic extermination. The ethnically targeted repressions hit Poland and German minorities in Ukraine particularly hard. Stalin's Polish operation of 1937 resulted in around 140,000 arrests, with 77% of those arrested facing execution. The People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, NKVD, conducted similar campaigns against Germans, Romanians, Greeks, and other nationalities until November 1938. The Greek operation alone led to the arrest of more than 20,000 people. The Soviet occupation of Poland in September 1939 triggered widespread repressions throughout Western Ukraine. By the spring of 1941, the authorities had forced hundreds of thousands into exile in Siberia and Kazakhstan. The deportees were Polish intellectuals, military families, political figures, and wealthy citizens of the Second Polish Republic. Even children and older adults were not spared. These exiles faced extreme temperatures and starvation. The Soviet authorities also deported 70,000 Jews who had fled to the USSR to escape Nazi persecution. These actions were part of the Soviet policy of forced Sovietization and purging Western territories of supposed enemies of the people. The German invasion of the USSR on June 22, 1941, sparked another wave of deportations. Soviet authorities began targeting entire ethnic groups from frontline territories, branding them as hostile based solely on their nationality. In August and September 1941, they deported nearly 80,000 ethnic Germans from Crimea and southern Ukraine. The NKVD's reach extended across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic countries, where they executed tens of thousands of political prisoners from local populations. German forces later used evidence of these mass killings to fuel their anti-Soviet and anti-Semitic propaganda. Given the brutal nature of Soviet rule, some Ukrainians initially welcomed the German invasion in the summer of 1941, seeing it as liberation from Stalin's terror. Ukrainian nationalist organizations and emigration movements viewed it as a potential pathway to restoring the Ukrainian state. Most of the population simply hoped for an improvement in living standards. Many still remember the Austrians before the First World War and the German occupation of 1918, which seemed gentle and merciful compared to Stalin's terror. However, the Nazi authorities did not support national movements. Instead, they divided Ukrainian territories into 5 zones. Romania received control of Bessarabia, Bukovina, and Transnistria governorates, while Hungary maintained its grip on Transcarpathia. The German occupation zone was split into 3 regions: the general government, including the district of Galicia, the Reichskommissariat Ukraine in central Ukraine, and a military administration zone covering eastern Ukraine and Crimea. Each territory had its distinct occupation policy, where some national groups enjoyed privileges, while others faced oppression. Ukrainians found the most opportunities in the general government, where German authorities supported them as a counterweight to Polish influence. In Kraków, the Ukrainian Central Committee operated legally under the leadership of geographer Volodymyr Kubilovich. This was followed by the establishment of the Ukrainian Regional Committee in Lviv in September 1941, led by Kost Penkievsky. Both organizations fostered educational and cultural activities, published materials, and provided social services. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church played a crucial role in Ukrainian social and cultural life during the war. Its leader, Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, tried to reduce violence during the war. His pastoral letters, many of which were banned from publication, condemned fratricide. Sheptytsky and other Ukrainian leaders wrote to Adolf Hitler on January 14, 1942, criticizing German policies in Galicia. He also wrote to SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler to condemn the killing of Jews, making him the only church leader in occupied territory to take such a bold stand. However, Germans suppressed Ukrainian political activity. The Bandera faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists (OUN) proclaimed the Act of Restoration of the Ukrainian state in Lviv on June 30, 1941. The OUN faction under Andriy Melnik's leadership established the Ukrainian National Council, a social and political organization in Lviv and Kyiv. By the summer of 1941, German authorities had arrested all active Bandera OUN members. By December, they had begun targeting Melnik's supporters. The campaign against Ukrainian nationalist resistance became so intense that by 1943 it had become one of the most important topics in Nazi security police reports. As a result, the Nazis arrested or killed over 80% of Bandera OUN members. German authorities quickly suppressed all attempts by Melnik OUN's march groups to establish pro-Ukrainian activities across the Reichskommissariat Ukraine and the military administration zone in Kyiv, Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkiv. In Romanian territory, any Ukrainian cultural and religious activity was prohibited. Nevertheless, German authorities exploited anti-Soviet sentiments and nationalist feelings to establish occupation authorities, police and military units. This strategy enabled them to secure cooperation from local residents. Researchers estimate that about 250,000 people served in the so-called Ukrainian formations within the Wehrmacht, SS, police and other occupation structures. According to General Yodel, 700,000 Soviet citizens served in the Wehrmacht alone. After the war, Stalin's regime accused various nationalities of treason, despite Russians forming the largest military formations serving Nazi Germany. We will discuss this in detail later. The restoration of Soviet power in 1943 and 1944 triggered mass deportations of entire peoples, including Kalmyks, Chechens, Ingush, Karachais, and Balkars. In total, more than 3.6 million people from various nations and ethnic groups were deported. They became victims of repression, although many had survived Nazi occupation. On May 18, 1944, Soviet authorities carried out the mass deportation of Crimean Tatars. By Stalin's order, they were accused of collaborating with the Nazis, and the entire nation was expelled from Crimea. Over 15,000 people passed through the so-called Crimean Tatar volunteer battalions during the Second World War. These battalions included not only Crimean Tatars, but also representatives of other nationalities. Most of these Crimean Tatar volunteers died during the war or were arrested by Soviet authorities after its end. Meanwhile, over 17,000 Crimean Tatars served in the Red Army throughout the war. However, when deportations began in 1944, thousands of Crimean Tatar war veterans were sent directly from military units to special settlements. Ahmet Han Sultan was one of the most famous Crimean Tatar servicemen in the Red Army, twice awarded Hero of the Soviet Union. While he was on leave visiting his parents in Alupka, NKVD officers arrived to arrest his mother. Only the intervention of General Khrukin, commander of the 8th Air Army, prevented her deportation. Ahmet Han Sultan spent the rest of his life advocating for his people's right to return to Crimea, representing a pivotal chapter in Crimean Tatar history. The May 1944 deportations affected more than 190,000 Crimean Tatars, soldiers and civilians alike, including children, women, and older adults. The conditions were horrific. Thousands were packed into cargo wagons without adequate food, water, or medical care. Death rates during the deportation ranged from 26% to 46% of all deportees. Most survivors found themselves in Uzbekistan, where they faced inadequate living conditions and forced labor. The ban on returning to Crimea persisted even after Stalin's death, and it would take 45 years before Crimean Tatars finally received official permission to return to their homeland. The designation of Crimean Tatars as traitors served as a cornerstone of Stalin's deportation policy and justified widespread repression that amounted to genocide. This narrative of betrayal became deeply embedded in Russian propaganda, reinforcing the concept of Crimea as primordially Russian territory. It provided justification for the peninsula's Russification and the reshaping of Crimea's ethnic composition, effectively removing Crimean Tatars as a significant ethnic group while increasing the Russian population. In conclusion, Ukrainians and other ethnic groups residing in Ukraine suffered significant losses from the colonial policies of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, which peaked during the Second World War.